Good evening, all. Welcome to the international webinar on the freedom of the press, organized by Department of Media Studies and Quality Assurance Cell of Christ Nagar College, Maranello, Trivandrum, Kerala. I'm Manju Mathews, Head of the Department of Media Studies, Christ Nagar College, Trivandrum. On behalf of our principal, Dr. Jolie Jacob, Director and Manager, Reverend Dr. Tito Verghese, CMI, Prasad, Reverend Father Subin Kotu, CMI, Program Coordinators, Emil Abraham, Reverend Father Timjo Pulinjivelin, Tara CB, Nino PK, and student coordinators, Arsha BS, and Ram Gopal Harikrishnan. We welcome all to this international webinar. We had a great response for this webinar when we announced it. Registrations came in all from across the country and abroad. Participants include media students, journalists, researchers, media professionals, and academicians. We have a large team joined from Philippines. Wishing you all a great session of learning. We are privileged to have eminent panel of speakers for this event. Guy Berger from UNESCO Paris, Ravi Prasad from International Press Institute, Vienna, Sanjay Kapoor from Editors Guild of India, New Delhi, and Professor Cherian join us from Hong Kong Baptist University. I invite Arsha BS, student coordinator of this webinar, to welcome all. Due to some technical issues, she couldn't join us. On her behalf, I welcome all speakers and participants. As India celebrates her 75th year of independence in 2021, Department of Media Studies of Christ Nagar College is launching a webinar series to discuss the issues around freedom of the press, safety of the journalists, and censorship. Leaders of India's freedom struggle, voice for free and independent media. Many of them were journalists and nurtured independent journalism around the country. We imbibe the spirit and courage of these leaders and journalists whose efforts made us win freedom. Today, we bring together thought leaders in journalism to shower insights on freedom of the press. A free and independent media is essential for the democratic process, good governance, and ultimately for human development. A free media ensures transparency and helps reduce corruption and misconduct. Democracy thrives when a nation projects the rights of the journalists, authors, bloggers, and news outlets. Citizens must have the freedom to openly discuss, evaluate, and speak critically. The fundamental right to seek and disseminate information through an independent press is under attack. This has increased over the recent past, and part of the assault has come from an unexpected source. Elected governments in many democracies, who should be press freedom's greatest defenders, have made serious attempts to silence critical media voices. Media outlets are forced to become mouthpieces of propaganda. This trend of media capture is linked to a global decline in democracy itself. There is a growing threat to journalism and journalists around the world. The offline and online harassments and intimidation of media professionals is growing at an alarming proportion. Media researchers and young journalists need to have a greater understanding of these issues. There are technological advancements as well as new models are evolving to support free press and independent journalism. This webinar series shall explore the current scenarios of press freedom and effective ways of safeguarding free and independent journalism. This webinar is dedicated to hundreds of journalists who got killed, who were jailed, who were harassed and threatened for unmasking truth. We have a 2-minute tribute video saluting those brave journalists. Thank you. Thank you, Emil Abraham, for creating that tribute video. Now we have our opening session. Guy Berger is responsible for UNESCO's global work on press freedom, safety of journalists, internet freedom, media pluralism, Guy Berger is responsible for UNESCO's global work on press freedom, safety of journalists, internet freedom, media pluralism, independence, gender and media and information literacy, and journalism education. Guy Berger coordinates all aspects of UNESCO's work in defending free expression from the various threats it faces globally. No one can better explain the relevance of press freedom than Guy Berger. Some instances in our lifetime make a powerful impact on individuals. In 1977, after the torture and death custody of renowned anti-apartheid activist Stephen Biko, Guy Berger became an activist for freedom, joining thousands who fought to bring an end to South Africa's notorious system of institutionalized racial discrimination. As a 24-year-old lecturer, Guy Berger was arrested for corresponding with Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. He spent 2.5 years in prison. Of that, 6 months were solitary confinement. Guy Berger's understanding of freedom of press comes from the real-life experiences. Before joining UNESCO, he headed the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University, South Africa. He also holds a PhD from Rhodes University. We are privileged to have the most ardent advocate of press freedom to have the opening speech for our webinar. Participants can type in questions for Guy Berger on the Mentimeter link shared in the chat box. Guy Berger shall speak about the freedom of the press and safety of the journalists. Welcome, Guy Berger.
Well, thank you so much, Madame Manju Rose Mathews, and congratulations to you for another series of really world-class webinars. And welcome to everybody who's participating. I think we owe Manju Rose a vote of thanks for assembling these kinds of panels. And it's very appropriate to do so at the time of the 75th anniversary. So congratulations. I could even say happy birthday for this auspicious occasion of 75 years. Thank you also for showing us that very sobering video beforehand about the killed journalists. And it reminds me that coming up on the 2nd of November this year is a very special day, which is recognized by the United Nations. It's called International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And the tragedy is not just that journalists are murdered in cases, apart from all the other pressures often put on them, but that those who are doing these crimes get away with murder, or get away with death threats, or get away with other kinds of pressures on journalists. And so this day, the 2nd of November, it's an attempt to say, we need justice for journalists. There should be the rule of law. Journalists should be free. Of course, everybody should be free. But because journalists are always so busy communicating, they are very much in the front line. But there should be justice in particular for those who are working in the media to bring us the news, to tell the stories of what's going on. And when there are attacks, especially fatal attacks, these do need to be investigated successfully. The police, the law enforcement, the prosecutors, the judges, they all need to be aligned to taking a stronger approach to this particular problem. Because as long as some journalists are being killed, other journalists are intimidated, and the result is that the public is deprived of key information. So it's about the rights of people to be journalists, and it's be journalists in safety, and it's the rights of the public to have the information that journalists are producing. So this is part of the situation that we sit with today, these attacks on journalists, which are not being brought to justice. Almost 9 out of 10 cases are not resolved. Sometimes there's a lack of political will, sometimes there's a lack of skills on the part of the police, sometimes the justice system is not really set up to do this. But it needs attention and it needs advocacy. So I do encourage on 2nd of November that everybody in this, you think about if you can raise awareness, have a look at the situation in your country. How many cases of killed journalists have been resolved and how many have not been? And put out a call for unresolved cases to be resolved, because as long as the impunity continues, it's difficult to send the signal that this is completely unacceptable. Those who want to attack journalists should know that there's a price to pay, and that price will be that they're going to face the full force of the law. Well, that's one thing we have learned over the years, that if you want to protect freedom of expression, you need the law to be active to protect freedom of expression and to protect journalists. There's no other way you can have that just informally. And if you don't have those laws, or if you have those laws and are not being enforced, that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Well, where does this come from, this idea of press freedom? There's many traditions, there's many people throughout history who have been pushing to be able to express opinions, to convey facts, even if these are unpopular with some quarters. And I suppose we could say in the more recent period, you had two experiences that brought to the fore this whole idea of press freedom. One was the Second World War, which was analyzed partially as being a result of warmongers and aggressive elements controlling the media and being able to indoctrinate populations for war and for aggression, for violence. So Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, they controlled their media and they were able to do this, to get a global war going. That was the one thing that people could begin to see. When there's not press freedom, the problem is that political power can be really concentrated and abused for very, very serious purposes. The second experience that I would point to, which relates, of course, now to your anniversary, is colonialism. Because colonialism was, of course, something done through massive physical dispossession, war, deprivation, control, occupation. But colonialism also had its information dimension, and that was information control as well. So information systems, media under colonialism was a tool of colonial control. So when people have looked at these two experiences, World War II and colonialism, they've drawn the conclusion that if one wants to reduce the chances of humanity being indoctrinated, if one wants to make it more difficult for control and occupation, you do need a free press. And so many journalists worldwide have been casualties of war and casualties of colonialism that we have learned that we have to say part of political freedom, part of independence has to be respect for human rights and respect for freedom of expression as one of the absolute cores in this. Without that, the whole thing can just implode. Now, freedom of expression, people would track to being formalized in the International Declaration of Universal Human Rights. And it says there that everybody has the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas. Seek, receive, and impart. So seek and receive is coming in, impart is going out. And the way that this has been further interpreted over the years is that imparting is the right to express, the right to use a public platform. Of course, it used to only be those in the media that could do this. But now, of course, with social media, everybody has got press freedom as a real possibility. So press freedom is imparting, and then you have the right to access information, especially information held by government on behalf of the public, and information that is even held by powerful corporations that might have information that impacts on your right to privacy, your right to security, your right to a clean environment. So there's your right to seek and receive information. And we know, of course, India in particular has a very strong right to information apparatus that people use very much to try to make sure that there is the kind of information that can support activities in favor of social justice, environmental justice, against corruption, and so on. So there are these two sides of the coin, a right to press freedom and right to information. And of course, where these are in law, in constitutions, this is the ideal situation. Now, the importance of this dispensation was actually well signaled by Amartya Sen, your compatriot who won the Nobel Prize. And he took note of analyzing history that famines in India and elsewhere have been very much a function of a lack of democracy and a lack of press freedom. And so in particular, he looked at the 1943 Bengal famine. And he came up with this very well-accepted hypothesis that, you know, in a country where there's a proper democracy and a proper free press, you don't get famines. Why is this? Because famines are man-made, human-made. And they're not just purely ecological catastrophes. And dealing with them are, of course, a function of humans and how accountable those in power are to address the situation, to prevent it, and then to ameliorate it when it happens. And so, you know, any disaster, crop failure, dispossession, displacement of people, I mean, all of these, they can really only be tackled if you've got a media that draws attention to the causes and the consequences, and public opinion then starts putting pressure on those with the power to do something to actually do it. So you can see how this is useful, not just for human rights, but also for development purposes. Now, just to touch on one or two other interesting issues, I think, which you may find of relevance. So press freedom and freedom of expression has got this dimension that people have the right, and that that is the default setting. It should be the way we normally go about things. And any restrictions should be exceptions. They should not be the rule. And they should really meet a lot of very strict conditions to be legitimate. They should be, first of all, necessary and proportionate. So you can't use a hammer to kill a fly. If somebody is defamed by somebody else, you know, they don't go and kill that person. I mean, that's completely disproportionate. It's completely illegal. But they could take an action in court. That's in the court may order the person, individual journalist to apologize and even pay damages sometimes. So that's part of the restrictions, that they have to be proportionate. And then they have to meet a legitimate purpose. So, you know, in terms of this, can't just be that a politician can threaten or restrict through law a journalist just because they don't like what's being said. No, that's not a legitimate purpose, because the purposes have to be compliant with democracy. And in democracy, it's legitimate to criticize politicians. Even if your facts are wrong, it's still legitimate to criticize them. Now, where it is legitimate to limit, according to the international law, to limit expression is, for example, if there's an imminent threat to public safety. So if there's a rumor about one community, you know, about to attack another community, and it's provoking communal riots, well, then a certain degree of limitation is accepted in international law. Again, it needs to be proportionate. For example, do you have to cut the whole internet to do that? Or can you just take action against those who are using social media to really incite violence, which is a less extreme measure. So there's those kinds of issues about restrictions. Now, I mentioned before, this focus on human rights and press freedom came about partially in reaction to the Second World War and partially in reaction to colonialism. And over the years, there was a new consideration that was brought to the table, which is this, that freedom means freedom from constraint, freedom from restrictions. And what a number of countries and academics and journalists began to say is, you know, it's all very well to have freedom, but where there's a lot of inequality, freedom's not really that beneficial to everybody. It's particularly beneficial to those in power. And so this was a big debate at UNESCO in the 1970s and 1980s, where people said, well, we've got a free flow of information, but it's an unequal flow. It's from the first world countries to the developing countries, and it's flooding and dominating the voices of developing countries. And why this became a debate is because one of the responses to this situation is to create more restrictions, to say, okay, we will restrict foreign information, we will restrict foreign ownership of media, because we want to protect our internal information. And that restriction, a lot of people began to express concern that that restriction could actually be used for abusive purposes, so that a government would complain about foreign reporting, but then be also restricting domestic journalists. So out of this, people also began to say, yes, there's a problem of inequality, but is the answer to tie the hands of the strong, or should we rather have enabling measures where we can make press freedom a more positive thing? It's not just the absence of restrictions and constraints and curbs. It's also positive. It's empowering people to be able to make use of this. And so you had a different approach, which is where the state, rather than closing the space for freedom of expression in the media, the state was encouraged to start opening up, to make it possible, for example, for private media to exist. In many countries in the developing world, it was only state media. And so under this pressure, people said, well, the state can enable private broadcasting. And then people say, well, that's very nice, private broadcasting. What about community broadcasting, which needs special attention because it's quite fragile. It's not making money in the same way as commercial broadcasting. So you need positive enabling measures to give subsidized airwaves to community media, for example. And then when you come to internet, it's also a question not just of the freedom to do things on the internet, to say things, but also how do you enable, first of all, connectivity at an affordable price? What's the policy environment, licensing environment, competition environment that can help that? And then how can you also help ensure that the different languages, for example, are being represented on, especially minority languages, rural areas, voices that are usually, discriminated, marginalized, of those at the bottom of the chain. How can you create some positive support for them? So this is an interesting thing now that I think we're at a point that people see these two sides of freedom of expression. The one that the state should not curb it, and the other one that the state should actually support it, and in a very meaningful way for all the population. Now, I'll just wrap up by mentioning two other historical developments which are of interest. One is that 30 years ago, after the end of the Cold War, there was a new mood sweeping the world, which was that excessive state control was not really good for democracy or for development. And so in that climate, a lot of states that had up to that point been owning all the media at hand, they came under pressure to start liberalizing, privatizing, opening up. And one of the momentous events from a media point of view here was what we call the Windhoek Declaration. Windhoek is the capital of Namibia in Southern Africa. And Windhoek was colonized by the country I come from, South Africa, but it won its independence in 1990. And in 1991, there was a conference there called the Windhoek Conference on Free, Pluralistic, and Independent Media. And this was really a conference that involved journalists. They were at the forefront, not politicians, not UNESCO, it was the journalists. And they said, enough is enough. We want to have free media. We want to have pluralistic media, not just domination by state media or domination by one or two companies. And we want independence. In other words, we want to be able to become professional journalists who can follow editorial standards and not be instrumentalized by governments or by owners to start distorting things in the interests of very particular power desires. So they said freedom, pluralism, and independence, three things which were very important. And this led to the United Nations then recognizing World Press Freedom Day, which was the anniversary that this declaration was done, which was the 3rd of May. So every year worldwide, you have the World Press Freedom Day, which is, again, a time to, like the 2nd of November, this is a time to really celebrate, protect, defend, tell people why it's so important, not just for the media, but for the society to have this press freedom and to get a better press freedom. In other words, that more people can make use of it in their own languages, their own access, and so on. And also to push for better independence, better professional standards in the media, more pluralism, and so on. So that was 30 years ago, and that's led to a lot of thriving of journalism, investigative journalism, much more better informed society. Now this year, 30th anniversary of that, there was again a UNESCO conference in Namibia, and it came with the Windhoek +30 declaration. And this took on board some additional issues. So it's not enough to have the freedom, it's not enough to have the pluralism, not enough to have the independence. There also has to be safety of journalists, and physical safety, but also online safety is becoming very important because there's so much abuse and intimidation taking place of journalists online, and surveillance of journalists and so on. So safety is a fourth element. But then this conference this year added these 3 things, which I'll summarize with the initials V, T, and C. The V is for viability, T is for transparency, and C is for capacity. So just to say a quick word about this, the V is for viability because in today's world, it's extremely difficult for news media to continue doing business as they used to do, because they now compete with all the internet companies and compete for advertising, they compete for attention, they compete for money. And so their viability is in question. And a lot of media are closing down, stopping hiring, even retrenching people. And indeed, for those areas they never even had, like a local newspaper or local radio, it's even more difficult to start right now. So viability needs attention, because you can have freedom, but if you don't have media that can pay its bills, well, it's not really a meaningful freedom. And there are different ways there of finding business models that can work through volunteers, through some subsidy from the state that should be independent and fair, through having some advertising, selling some services, and so on. But this is a big challenge to get that right, the viability story. Transparency, this is in relation to internet companies, because today a huge amount of media content is not accessed direct from the media, but through social media or search. And so nobody quite knows exactly why they get certain kinds of information recommended to them or at the top of their feeds or the top of their search results rather than others. And often, as we know, there's not information that's coming to the top. There's disinformation, there's misinformation, there's hate, there's kind of some sort of I would say, interesting but entertaining content, but not really important to living your life today and making important decisions. So transparency, we need transparency, so these internet companies have to better account for how they moderate and curate the content, especially the news content. What comes up, what goes out, what goes down, what goes sideways. And the last one is capacities, because it's evident today that people are still less informed than we would like about what to expect from media, what to expect from social media, how these institutions work, what would be, what the public should ask them to behave, so that if media are behaving badly, or if people are behaving badly on the internet, or if internet companies are not living up to their standards, that people can understand this and then develop the demand for some kind of quality and that they themselves can produce quality, and they themselves don't then click without thinking, share without thinking. So that's the capacities. We at UNESCO, we call it media and information literacy. That we need to enhance everyone's capacities, how to use this technology safely, how to use it with awareness of human rights, how to respect privacy, how to really promote a healthy discourse and appreciate journalism and defend journalism. So VTC. Well, I think I'm going to wrap up at that point then, Manju, Rose, Mathews, and happy to, if there's any comments, questions, to respond further. But just in summary to say, really, we've come as humanity a long way. India is 75 years of independence. We've learned a lot. The world as a whole, since the 1940s, we've learned a lot also about press freedom and how important it is. We've learned also about how important it is to have not just a negative view of freedom, but a positive view of freedom. And then we've had these elaborations of what you need. Press freedom must not only be freedom, but pluralism and independence and safety and viability and transparency, and also then the capacities of people. So thank you.
Thank you, Guy Berger, for the opening speech, and it was a really enlightening speech. And we shall have now an interactive session with our young journalist, Nino Pikesh, our faculty, shall moderate the session.
A very good evening, sir. Myself, Devika. So a question that actually came to my mind when I heard you speak was, we know that a free and a pluralizing press is very essential for any democracy. So, sir, can you please tell us what role UNESCO is actually playing in order to ensure that there is freedom of press in the Indian subcontinent specifically?
Well, thank you for that question. We have an office in Delhi, which works with a range of partners, including journalism schools, to try and have projects in these areas. Of course, India is a huge country, so I don't think we can reach everybody there. But what we do is particularly put emphasis on trying to support the training of journalists to be better journalists, to really be independent, to be professional, to understand their obligation to society, to not end up being used, or how they can do the best job they can. And then we've also been doing work not only with I suppose the general professionalism, but specifics, because in today's world, if journalists are going to be distinctive, because there's so much other content going around, if journalists are going to be distinctive, they need a lot of expertise. And so we've produced a number of resources, and we're trying to develop these in further languages, thanks also to Manju Rose's support here, but to at least to in Hindi, but in other Indian languages, about, for example, reporting on climate change. Because as you can see, the world is burning, the world is flooding. These are enormous issues, and journalists need to understand what's the best way to tell the story in a way which will make a difference. Then we've also done a lot of resources on how to report on disinformation, because how do you as a journalist really be sure that you yourself are not doing disinformation, but that you can investigate and tell the story of those who are. So those are ways in which we're trying to develop specific expertise. And then coming up, we'll also be having resources about how to report on artificial intelligence, because this is a big thing that's changing societies and will increasingly do so. And again, so media need to know how to do that. So those are some of the areas that we work in, particularly with media. And then we've also been promoting this, what we call media and information literacy. Now, in October every year, at the end of the last week of October, there is what the United Nations big family has called the Global MIL Week. And so we will be organizing activities in India, because everybody can play a role in promoting these competencies of the public about communications, about journalism, and so on. But it can start in the schools, in the curricula. So UNESCO's got some model curricula, a lot of examples to train teachers, for teachers to use. UNESCO's also got experiences about how media itself has been trying to educate the public about how is a story made, what are the risks that a journalist faces, how does a journalist decide what information to leave in and what to take out, and so on. So this year, coming up in the last week of October, we'll be working with anybody interested in India to really promote that media and information literacy. And then I can go on and on, but I just say one other thing that we are aware of is, of course, gender issues. And so what UNESCO is especially interested in is trying to get gender equality in the media and through the media. And so we have a number of programs in that regard, because, you know, not just India, but most of the world is lagging in this regard. Although it's in the Sustainable Development Goals agreed by everybody, we're still very far from having gender equality in our societies. And media has a big role to play, both in itself, in the staffing of media, and then in the output of the media. So yeah, and well, let me also just mention one other thing. Community radio, although it's still not a huge phenomenon in India compared to other countries, UNESCO is working quite a lot with networks there about how these community radio stations can better understand to report disasters, how they can play a role combating disinformation, COVID disinformation, especially given that crisis. There is a UNESCO designated or honored professor in Hyderabad, who's the chair of community radio, who does a lot of work in partnership with us and with our other academic chairs around the world. So that gives you a bit of an idea of some of the things. But in the end, India is a strong and a proud country. India, you know, it's people in India themselves who can and are and will make for better media to serve the society that you live in, and will address all the challenges that we face here.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for answering that question, sir. I am Meenu, and I'll be moderating the question and answer session from here on. Okay, so this next question is from one of our students, Ashwin. Ashwin, you can ask the question now.
Hi, sir. Very good evening. Good evening to you, sir. I come across a question after hearing your moving speech. So my question to you is: media is supported by large advertising that is spent from corporations, governments, etc. So does this affect the press freedom in developing countries, and what are the effective alternative models used?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're correct that historically a huge amount of the media is funded by advertising, and there have been problems there in all countries, that some advertisers have tried to use that power to blackmail the media house to avoid certain stories or to do other stories. some media have also compromised their standards where they present content which is really advertising, but it's not labeled as advertising. So they have fallen short of their ethical standards there. And in some cases, governments, state advertising, national advertising, state advertising, even city advertising, it has been abused to reward some media and punish other media, not on any objective basis, but purely for political reasons. And advertising, it really should be something that's not an instrument for supporting or punishing media. Advertising should be because the person advertising or the agency advertising wants to reach a certain audience at the best, most cost-effective way. And that should be the only criterion. And we really have to push increasingly around the world that state advertising that comes from the state. It must be transparent. The budget must be transparent. How it's decided about who goes where is absolutely important for the public to know. And for that also there needs to be data about, well, how many users does this website actually have? Is it audited? What's the viewership of this television station? Is it audited? So that you have reliable figures so that advertising can really be developed. And so there's a big role for media research there. Now, having said that, a lot of advertising, as we know, worldwide, it's shifting away from the media and it's going to internet companies. And the reason for that is that the internet companies have a lot more data about the audience. And so they can customize much more efficiently than the mass media what kinds of audiences can be micro-targeted. And the advertisers like this because it means they're not wasting their money, with the shotgun approach. It's much more a sniper approach. And the media companies, by and large, don't nearly have this kind of data. Now, there are some problems with the internet companies because they, first of all, are collecting so much data on everybody, which can be leaked, can be abused, can be manipulated. And the data that they collect can even include, I'll give you one example, which came to light in the US. People were posting on Facebook, as they do, that they had a bereavement in the family. And then a company went and got all those names and people who bereaved, people who are vulnerable and depressed. And then they went and marketed to these big evangelical churches, which are in many cases big businesses. And they said, these are people, their psychological state of mind is such that they will be receptive if you advertise to them. And then these big churches they would know in a certain city, in a certain neighborhood, these are the people who should get that advertising, and Facebook could deliver such advertising to them. And those people receiving that advertising didn't even know that they're being targeted in a very manipulative way because of this. And then that data was also then sold to political parties. So, the whole thing became very problematic. And the other problematic thing with the internet and advertising is that in the media, often there's sensitivity to putting advertising in relevant content. So if there's a magazine or a website on sports, then obviously, it makes sense that advertising on sports will go there. On the internet, it doesn't happen like that. It's based not on the topics of the content, it's based on the profiling of the people. And the result of this is that you get some advertising next to terrible speech, hate speech, for example. And yet there's major brands, it's adverts, they end up being there because people going there, it's a profile-based, not an environment-based advertising model. And nevertheless, there's been some campaigning about that, but still the internet companies have more and more of the advertising, and the media companies can't catch up, especially even when the media companies are using the social media, because the ones who keep the data is the social media company, not the news media company. So the answer to this really is, and this comes back to the viability issue, that media have to develop new streams of revenue. They have to find multiple ways to get money. And these can be in a variety of things: events organizing, consultancy services, educational services, packaging particular content that is labeled as sponsored content, but then the sponsor knows that this is going in an environment that's not hate speech, for example, because it's not like this automated thing on the internet. And subscriptions is another thing that, some media are getting subscriptions, payments, and they have different tiers of access for subscription. And some are forming membership clubs, and they get supporters to donate money. Some are getting donations from wealthy people with a good social intent, and so on. So there's a mixed model. And more, if journalism and media are going to survive, this is what they have to do. They can't depend on advertising because it's too risky. It has its own complications. There's still a place for it, but it can't be the only way going. And I think that the idea that they can win back advertising from the social media companies, it's not really going to happen. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Actually, we have a lot of questions coming up, but due to our limited time, we have to stop the session with one more question. So this last question is from Theophine. Theophine, you can ask your question now. Please unmute your microphone.
Hello, sir. My name is Theo, and I would like to ask you a doubt. So, the safety of women journalists, it's really a big concern. So, they face so many threats which are really sexual in nature, or death threats. So my question is, how is UNESCO trying to tackle the situation, or how is UNESCO trying to push governments to introduce new policies to ensure the safety of women journalists?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking that question, because this is such a growing problem, and I'm sure you know about some of it, and many of the participants here will also know about it. But it seems that in recent years, it's almost like open season for people to abuse women, particularly women journalists who are in the public limelight. And what can be done about this? So UNESCO says, first of all, the main responsibility to protect people, in this case women, is the government. I mean, the purpose of the government is to provide safety, security, at the most bottom basic function. And so governments really have to become much more aware of these issues and have capacity to deal with them. So in some cases, indeed, some governments have begun to create special teams of police, of prosecutors, to really follow this up and make sure that there is legal action against those perpetrators. In other cases, some governments have spoken out. Of course, we do know there are cases when politicians themselves are involved in this kind of abuse, but in good practice, those who believe in standards of human rights and gender equality, they've stood up and said that it's wrong. We can't allow this. It's not the norm. It cannot become a norm. So the one thing then is to sensitize the governments and to advocate, and that doesn't happen. Governments have got 101 things on their plates. They're not going to pay attention or put resources into this unless there's a strong lobby. And that lobby's got to come from groups like UNESCO, which can also bring some expertise, but it's got to come from media in the country, from students, from media houses, from journalists, women's groups, and well-wishers, parliamentarians and so on, who really want to see some action on this thing. And then, of course, there's others that have got a role to play. So internet companies. Let me quickly mention here that there's a famous journalist called Maria Ressa, from the Philippines. And this year she won the UNESCO World Press Freedom Prize for her amazing work over the years. She has been receiving so much abuse and really terrible. I mean, you have to read this to see how disgusting it is and traumatizing. Death threats and abuse about her appearance and everything. I mean, you can't even stop imagining the abuse. But she was getting more than 60 of these threats per hour. Now, you can't expect a person like that to have to protect themselves, to be click, report abuse, click, report abuse, click, report abuse. Here, the internet companies have to do more. And well, UNESCO's been publishing a lot in this area. We've got a very interesting report. You can find it online quite easily. And as a result of that, we did hear that some of these internet companies are going to start creating things where women journalists can register, as it were, to say we're a women journalist, and then Facebook will give more attention to trying to protect those women against this. Now, what does protection mean? That needs to be worked out a bit, because they can block, okay, that's important. But there's also a question then of whether they allow these people to just change their identities and carry on with another. Also, blocking as opposed to expelling people from the platform altogether. And then one of the differences is also if you block the stuff, what's the impact on evidence? Because there needs to be evidence for a court case. So it's a complicated issue, but certainly the internet companies got to play a role here. And again, they won't do anything. They just want to make money. So unless people really hammer them, they won't do it. And then media owners themselves have got a huge role to play. Media owners, they've got to recognize that if they want to get stories told by women journalists and get women journalists' perspectives and access to a lot of issues and women who wouldn't speak in the same way to a male journalist, they've got to do something, and they've got to help give support to these women journalists. Actually, we've just seen in the UK, and UNESCO itself will come quite soon, a checklist, so how women journalists can report to their bosses when there are incidents, and advice, guidance them what to ignore, what to report, whether you report to the police, how to use some self-protection measures. So the employers have got a role to play. And then, of course, the women journalists themselves and the men journalists have got to really be engaged in this. And so if some of the abuse is not just on WhatsApp or something like that, but some of the abuse is on public forum, other people need to come forward and say, out of order, you cannot abuse women here and not women journalists. So these are the kind of things that UNESCO is doing. And that fits in with what I said, also trying to promote transparency in these internet companies. Because we want to know exactly what are their policies, what are they doing, how many cases are they coming across, how responsive are they to these women journalists? Because we need them to disclose. If they don't disclose, there's no confidence that they really are taking this seriously. So please do join that and look at those UNESCO resources. And if you come across these issues, don't ignore them. Don't take them lying down. You've got to take some action. Should be appropriate action. You don't want to feed the trolls, as it were. But you can't just let this abuse continue, because not only does it have terrible psychological effects, but it can also create a climate for offline violence, stalking, threats to families, and actual physical attacks and murders. So the stakes are high. And press freedom without safety of women journalists, it's not that helpful. We need both. Well, it's a pleasure answering the questions. I'm sorry there's no more time, but I've been taking a lot of time already, so I guess we come back to you, Manju Rose Mathews, to take us to the next stage.
Yes. Thank you so much for answering the question, sir. Because of the limited time, we couldn't ask a lot of questions, but we are getting a lot of questions from the participant side. So anyways, thank you so much for answering all the questions and spending so much time with us. Now I hand over the session to Manju ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Nino. And thank you, Guy Berger, for your answers. And we have many more questions, but due to time constraints, we need to move forward. On the behalf of participants, I extend our sincere gratitude. Your contributions to the cause of free speech and freedom of press are remarkable. This is surely a continuous fight to uphold the true purpose of journalism. We wish you good luck for inspiring many more generations of journalists to be brave and bold. Thank you once again. Our next speaker is Ravi Prasad. Ravi R. Prasad is a global head of outreach at the International Press Institute. A global network of editors, media executives, and journalists. Ravi is based in Vienna. He leads IPS global. He was a journalist for over 20 years and covered conflicts in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Indonesia, and Kosovo. He has reported for The Pioneer, The Times of India, The Statesman, BBC, World Service, Deutsche Welle, the Christian Science Monitor, amongst others. Later, he worked in the field of advocacy and communications with Oxfam, Action Aid, ICADA in Syria, Child Helpline International, and UNICEF. He holds a degree in science from Allahabad University and a master's in reconciliation and peace building from the University of Winchester in the United Kingdom. Participants can ask questions on Mentimeter link to Ravi, and he's also a faculty of Asian School of Journalism. He's a visiting faculty teaching investigative journalism. So participants can ask questions in the Mentimeter link. Our colleague Tara CB shall pick the questions and ask Ravi after the session. Ravi shall speak about the impact of pandemic on global press freedom. He shall also take us through the initiatives of International Press Institute. Welcome, Ravi.
Oh, thank you, Manju. Hope everybody can hear me. Yes?
Yes.
So it's a pleasure to be here, especially amongst young Indian journalist students who will soon take over from peers of mine who are editors and senior journalists there. So it's a pleasure to talk to young people, and I've been working with young people quite a lot. I used to be faculty at the Asian College of Journalism long ago when I was based in India. And then when I left, well, I stopped teaching there, but I do take some classes here and there and also speak to journalists around. So let me start with a brief presentation that I have made for you, which includes what's IPI and what are the threats to journalism because of COVID-19. And I would like to mention here that we work very closely with UNESCO, and Guy Berger has been one of our great inspirations. And I will answer one of Devika's questions on what UNESCO is doing in South Asia, particularly in India, because we are engaged in that program. So let me start this presentation with you guys. Can I share the screen, please? Okay, screen sharing is disabled, so I can't really show you the presentation, but I'll tell you in a nutshell what IPI does and what IPI has been working on since the last 71 years. So as Guy said in his presentation, press freedom faced threat from communism and also autocracies. So in 1950, few editors from around the world came together at Columbia University in New York, and they set up the International Press Institute with the purpose of protecting, defending press freedom and safety of journalists. The fear was that communism would stifle press freedom around the world. So this institution was created. M. Challapati Rao of National Herald, who was editing National Herald at that time, was one of the founders of IPI. And later, C.R. Irani, who was the editor-in-chief of The Statesman, was chair of IPI for 2 terms. So and currently we have Malayalam Manorama, Hindu, and several other news organizations in India and individual journalists as members of IPI. It's a membership-based organization which has editors, media institutions, and journalists as members. So in a way, we represent the media industry per se. And in the last several years, that's
Excuse me,
21 years. Yes.
The screen sharing is enabled. You can
Okay, that's perfect. So I will now share the screen and show you the presentation. It isn't coming up. Hold on a second. Yes. So the focus of IPI is on promoting and safeguarding press freedom. And as I said, it started in 1950 to protect press freedom from communism. And the second priority of ours is safety of journalists, and we support journalists who are in conflict with law. Journalists who are harassed legally, journalists who get cases filed against them, and the latest trend is the strategic litigation against public participation. We call the SLAP suits filed against journalists, and it's more common in Europe. And the fourth most important work that we do is improving quality of journalism. We work with journalist community around the world to try and provide them with knowledge through exchange of knowledge with other journalists, creating knowledge exchange platforms and best practices. And that's a peer-to-peer work. It's not a college or a classroom environment. So we work in creating capacity of journalists through sharing of experience. Our global approach is, as we advocate for press freedom, our focus is on direct advocacy. And one of the tools we use is press freedom missions, where we take journalists and senior editors from the region to a country where press freedom is under threat. And we engage with policy and decision makers, civil society, organizations, journalists, unions, and diplomats to put pressure on governments to allow press to function independently without any challenges that they face because of laws or because of harassment by the people in power. We also do intensive campaigning in partnership with like-minded organizations and networks, and UNESCO is a great partner in that. I'll come to UNESCO's partnership later when I talk to you about the South Asia initiative we have. And we communicate, and we use communications as a tool for advocacy, the public advocacy, to create demand for the supply. Unless people are aware, and unless people start demanding media freedom, journalists alone can't do it. There has to be, as I also said, literacy, media literacy. And when there is media literacy, then they can demand for press freedom. They can demand for information without censorship. And we work with partner organizations in different regions to promote this kind of public advocacy and engage with the public themselves so that they can raise the demand. Fourthly, we have Death Watch. As was said earlier, 3rd of November is the day to impunity for crimes against journalists. IPI has been documenting deaths of journalists since 1997. And every year we publish a report around November 3rd to highlight how many journalists have been killed and also how many cases have not been investigated. A large number of cases in Mexico, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh remain unsolved because authorities and governments are not interested in pursuing these cases. If you all remember, Gauri Lankesh was murdered in 2017. Her case still remains unsolved. Nobody's been arrested and charged. Those who were arrested were released on bail. And there are several such cases in the country itself where investigations are slow. Sulabh Srivastav, a journalist, was killed a few days ago in Pratapgarh in Uttar Pradesh. His case, police said, was a motorcycle accident. And then when we put pressure on the police, they've registered a case of murder and started investigating. So IPI uses its network. IPI has national committees in every country, which is made up of editors and journalists, and we work through them to put pressure on governments. And we also rally the civil society organizations together to demand for press freedom, safety of journalists, and investigation of cases of crimes against journalists. Here, we have some very good programs around the world, and the first one would answer Devika's question and make you aware of what we do. So last year, we got a grant from UNESCO through their Global Media Defense Fund, and we launched this first ever cross-border journalism collaboration in South Asia, bringing news organizations from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal together. So in Pakistan, we have Dawn, which is a highly reputed newspaper. In India, we work with Malayalam Manorama and The Week. In Bangladesh, we work with the Daily Star, which also has a Bangla edition called Prathamalo. And in Nepal, we have Nagrik, which is a Nepali newspaper, and its English counterpart, Republica. So these publications together are investigating stories of attacks on journalists, attacks on press freedom, different laws that have been formulated to stifle press freedom in the country. And they come up with these stories and they share the reports. So what is published published by Pakistan newspaper Dawn is also published by The Week, the Daily Star, Nagrik, and Republica. And on 8th of March, all these news organizations did a story on harassment of women journalists. And it was published, all the 4 stories were published in all the newspapers on 8th of March, the International Women's Day. Similarly, on 3rd of May, we had stories on press freedom in these 4 countries. And these were published across all the 4 to 5 newspapers and the magazine. So we're trying to create awareness and create a demand for press freedom using the media itself. Unless journalists themselves start talking about attacks on them, there won't be an impact. So we want journalists to raise these issues, and we just push it from behind. We are the drivers or catalysts, but we're encouraging journalists to work together. We are now planning a similar intervention in Africa, where we want to bring journalists and media organizations across sub-Saharan Africa together and work towards creating this awareness by reporting on media freedom and attacks on journalists. In South Asia, we also come up with a fact sheet every month, which lists all the attacks and press freedom violations. Now, next one you see is the Media Freedom Rapid Response Program, which we have created in Europe with some partner organizations. And here we collect information about press freedom violations and attacks on journalists, and we report it to the European Union, which then goes to its member states where the violations have happened and asks them to submit a report. There comes the accountability process, which we still don't have in South Asia or in Africa. But because there is this European Union, which brings together 27 European nations, the European Union is able to ask governments for their accountability towards the violations. So similarly, Council of Europe also has a platform which covers all the European countries where the states have to respond when we file complaints of attacks or press freedom violations. Besides that, we have a major campaign in Turkey funded by the European Union. And there we're fighting for journalists who are in prison. At one point of time, there were 137 journalists in prison. We've been advocating very actively in the region, along with partner organizations like CPJ or Reporters Without Borders and journalist organizations in Turkey. What we do is Besides public campaigning, we go to Turkey, meet with government officials. We try to convince government officials to release these prisoners. But we also file amicus curiae in cases of journalists that have come up at the European Court of Justice, because that's the European Court, when it issues a judgment, that is binding on the country. So we try to lead ourselves into the cases by filing amicus curiae and then present our viewpoint. It's just to add pressure on the governments to act. Similarly, we have a direct advocacy campaign in Egypt, which is one of the biggest jailers of journalists in the world. There are, at the moment, over 67 journalists are in prison without being charged and not even tried once. They are all in what they call the pre-trial detention, which is extended every 3 months. And some of these journalists have been in prison since 2015. And when there was an outbreak of COVID in the prisons of Egypt, we asked them to release all the journalists who were there, the prisoners of conscience, all the human rights activists. But the government released all the murderers and thieves, but ignored our call and kept the journalists in prison. 2 of them died because of COVID in the prison. Now, the online harassment, there was a question on this. IPI has been working on online harassment for the last 5 years. We've been working with partner organizations, with women's organizations and journalists themselves. And we have created a program. Please visit the program on the website. It's called On the Line. And 2 years ago, we did a major documentary, which is called A Dark Place. Well, it was an interview of journalists, women journalists around the world who've been facing harassment. And this will and then we have also created tools where we work with newsrooms to provide them these tools to curtail and counter harassment of women journalists, and how to monitor content that comes on from the audiences and readers onto their websites. So this our training program has been quite successful, and in Brazil we are about to train about 100 newsrooms with our trainers, so that the capacity of newsroom managers, newsroom moderators can be built in dealing with these attacks, and also empowering women journalists on dealing with these attacks. And of course, we do a lot of work. If you see the online database we've got, we have been collecting the legal database from around the world, so that journalists and practitioners are able to access this database to see what kind of laws are there in different countries regarding the media. And the current situation, what we're seeing is more and more countries are coming up with laws in the name of fake news, in the name of controlling the social media. And these laws will stifle press freedom and freedom of expression in almost all the countries which are now preparing for it, including Nepal. Bangladesh already has it in the region, which is called the Digital Security Act, which prevents journalists from taking a photograph in a government office, or even taking a document out of the government office. We all journalists, when we are doing investigative reporting, we do need those documents. And if somebody is caught taking a document or a picture, that person can be prosecuted and sentenced to life. That is 14 years in prison. 2 months ago, Bangladesh's most well-known investigative women journalist, a woman journalist called Rosina Islam, was arrested in the health ministry's office. That became a major issue. Even the foreign minister of Bangladesh had to say that was a mishap and government should not have done it. So we were advocating for her release. She was released on bail, and a lot of partner organizations joined us in that campaign. But laws are now being used to stifle press freedom around the world. Now I come to the point where we talk about COVID-19 and press freedom. So as COVID started spreading, instead of working with the media to provide accurate information so that people could make informed choices, governments started to crack down on the media, silence the media, silence all the criticism. Journalists who were reporting on shortcomings in government's response to the COVID, they were arrested, they were charged, they were sent to prison. very well-known journalist in Zimbabwe, Hopewell Chinono, spent weeks and weeks in the prison because he was denied bail. All he had done was expose corruption in procurement of equipment by the health ministry. We saw this happen across the world in almost all the countries. Even in Europe, we saw things where the journalists were attacked, beaten, intimidated. So in February 2020, IPI, as the COVID started spreading, IPI decided to collect data and created this Press Freedom Tracker, which is a searchable database to see what kind of attacks are taking place, where these attacks are taking place. So far, we have collected information about 645 press freedom violations related to COVID-19 alone. And these are from around the world. This include, which I'll explain to you later, threats, intimidation, legal action, new laws, and physical and verbal attacks. In the Asia-Pacific region, we counted 210 press freedom violations linked to COVID-19, which is the second highest in almost all the regions. And amongst these, in the Asia region, South Asia region alone, the most number of attacks were in these 4 countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And as I'm sure Sanjay will be speaking to you all, who is the General Secretary of the Editors Guild, he knows more about what's happening in India. But I can tell you that the situation is quite precarious, even now as COVID spreads in Nepal quite rampantly, and in Bangladesh, efforts are underway by governments to clamp down on the media so that the real picture doesn't emerge, which is sad because government should be working with the media to give a clear picture and people can then take precautions. If we can counter disinformation about the vaccine, disinformation about the virus, and put to rest all the doubts in the minds of people. But that, unfortunately, is not happening. So what kind of threats journalists face? COVID or no COVID? The major threats that journalists face are arrests and charges. They're targeted, first of all, they're targeted for their work. And if you look at our death watch list, you will see the number of journalists killed every year because of the work they do, because of exposing corruption. And they are targeted by people in power or people who are supporters of people in power. The second one is arrests and charges, then criminal investigations. Quite a few journalists face criminal investigations, and in many countries, defamation still remains a criminal procedure and not a civil one. We've been advocating that criminal defamation should be abolished. Many countries have done it. In Sri Lanka, in South Asia region, Sri Lanka was a country which has abolished criminal defamation, which was because of a campaign that was run by the editors and journalists starting in 2000. And in 2020, they celebrated 20 years of their success, and they were demanding for more. But in India, you still have a chance of filing a criminal defamation case. I had 2 filed against me, which didn't go anywhere because the organization was ready to fight the case. And you have to submit or you have to deposit 1/4 of the amount that you're claiming as a defamation in the defamation lawsuit. And those who wanted to go for defamation against me didn't deposit the money. And then we have this and I spoke to you about the civil lawsuit, the slaps that are frequently being used in Europe, and very soon in different parts of the world, you will see cases being filed against journalists in advance so that they cannot publish stories. And these slap suits are mostly coming from private sector, big organizations that work closely with people in power. As media capture has increased in Turkey, most of the media organizations are now owned by businesses that are supporters of the president, Mr. Erdogan. Similarly, in Hungary, a large number of media organizations have now been bought over by people who are close to Mr. Orban, who is the prime minister there. In Poland, a similar thing is happening. And in countries in South Asia, we've seen that political parties and especially the nationalist parties, are starting their own TV channels or trying to provide support to TV channels which are started by their supporters. So media capture also leads to lawsuits. Businesses don't want to see stories critical of them, so they file these suits, and they are encouraged by the governments to do it. Then the restriction on access to information is another problem. While India has a very strong freedom of information law, many countries don't. And what happened with COVID was when journalists filed for information, the governments extended the deadline for the response or decided that they would suspend the right to information for the time being. And that has happened. Also, there were travel bans and restrictions on traveling. Journalists could not go out to cover or report. And we saw this in the case of journalists in Africa quite a lot. In India, too, we've seen quite a few cases were filed against journalists. They were not allowed to travel. And then we have this problem of accreditation, which is revoked in many countries. You cannot function if you don't have an accreditation card. And without an accreditation card, movement during the lockdown was really very difficult. In Brazil, in the Philippines, in many Latin American countries, and in Southeast Asian countries like Philippines and Cambodia and Vietnam, journalists were denied access to press conferences, they were denied access to official briefings, and in several countries they were told to publish data that has been provided by the government. They were not allowed to publish data they had collected from the hospitals directly or from civil society groups that were working with COVID-affected people. And censorship is one of the major threats. We've seen several governments going to court asking for permission to clamp down on journalists or asking courts to give directions to journalists to not publish data that has not been provided by them or to stop publishing stories that are critical of government in the name of managing the COVID response. So censorship has again raised its head. India had faced censorship during emergency. And I personally witnessed emergency, went through it when I was based in Sri Lanka, and the government had imposed censorship, preventing journalists, whether local or foreign, to write about the conflict that was when the Sri Lankan armed forces were facing a defeat at the hands of the Tamil Tigers. So for 3 months, we could not file stories, and we had to submit it to a censor before we could submit the story. And we got back our copies, but lots of sentences erased or blackened with ink so that we couldn't publish it. Then, as was mentioned earlier, forced closure of media outlets also because they were denied advertising. Media outlets that were very critical of the government in many countries have been closed down. Their ads, they were deprived of ads, and governments have used their influence with the public sector and the private sector to deny those advertisements to the media outlets. So they had no choice but to close down. The laws that have now been implemented in the name of fake news or in the name of controlling unlawful activities or disaster management, under those laws, publications have been banned. They've been ordered to take down their stories which were on their internet websites or were forced to delete. And in some cases, they were fined. They were told they were banned from publishing. And in Tanzania, there is a law which is called the Media Services Act. Under that law, the government can ban publications, they can take them off air, they can ask the media house to delete the story, apologize, and it has been used very frequently in Tanzania. We took a press freedom mission to meet met the Prime Minister, the media minister. They agreed that they would enter into a conversation with journalists, but that hasn't happened. Fortunately, there has been a change in the government there. There's a new president who seems to be more friendly towards the media, but we still have to see how it unfolds. And as you know, fake news regulations are a major problem. They're being frequently used to clamp down on the media. Surveillance and endangering source of protection But we've all seen what has happened with Pegasus, not just in India, but across the world. Governments have used the spyware to spy on journalists. Even when the software, the spyware was not there, government was doing it in the name of preventing the spread of COVID. In Israel, they tried to prevent the spread of COVID in the name by saying that we will trace your contacts through your mobile phones and your location. If a journalist's location is known and journalist publishes an investigative story the next day, they know which phone was next to the journalist's phone and they know who the contact is. So journalists in Israel went to court against this and they got an injunction from the court which said that journalist phones will not be tapped. They will not track them. So, but this kind of tracking happens very frequently in many of the countries. And then we see a lot of attacks, verbal, online, and physical attacks by authorities themselves. In India, we've seen quite a few attacks. In Bangladesh, in Pakistan, we've seen several attacks. Last month, the armed forces personnel entered the house of a journalist and thrashed him. He had to be hospitalized. 2 days ago, another journalist was attacked in Bangladesh. So these attacks by authorities are quite frequent. During elections in Uganda, we saw journalists were thrashed by the police. And the Inspector General of Police went on as saying, if we tell you not to go in a particular direction, and if you go, we have no other choice but to beat you. So that kind of open threats were made to journalists, and these are very common. And then we all know about the verbal attacks and intimidation by people themselves, because we found that during the lockdown, if journalists were filming or noticing violation of lockdown, people themselves attacked journalists to prevent them from publishing or recording or taking pictures of those attacks. And then we have online intimidation or smearing of journalist characters by authorities, people in power, public figures, and their supporters. So overall, it seems COVID-19 actually increased the level of threat for journalists, and we've been fighting very hard. In 2020, the second Global Media Freedom Conference was held by Canada and Botswana together. It was an online conference for which we at IPI, we wrote a policy paper on COVID-19 and media freedom. And during this conference, they had a session on it. We have made certain recommendations on what should be the steps taken both by governments, people themselves, and journalists to end this threat to the safety of journalists. Thank you. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ravi, for the enlightening session. And our moderator, Tara CB, will be moderating the question answer session. She's our faculty. A lot of questions are pouring in. Hope you have time to answer the question answers.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. This is Tara Ravishankar, and I will be moderating this session. I think this is a very interesting session and very current topic. And here are the questions. Do the penal code, security law, or any other laws restrict reporting, and are journalists or bloggers punished under these laws? I'll repeat the question. Do the penal code, security laws, or any other law restrict reporting, and are journalists or bloggers punished under these laws?
If there are no particular laws that prevent journalists from reporting, there are other penal codes that are used to prevent journalists from doing their work. We've seen Disaster Management Act, we've seen Unlawful Activities Prevention Act being used in India to prevent journalists from reporting. The Digital Security Act in Bangladesh is frequently invoked to prevent journalists from reporting and being critical of the government. So you don't need a particular law which prevents journalists from reporting, or you don't need a law to close down media institutions. What you need is the existing law and how it's used. Hopewell Chinono was in prison because he exposed corruption, but they didn't. They used their normal IPC, the Zimbabwe Penal Code, to put him in prison. We have cases of journalists in Egypt and in Turkey where they're being accused of working with organizations that are against the national integrity, national unity, and or working with what they call terrorist organizations, which have been designated with terrorist organizations. So different laws are used by different governments to attack press freedom.
Sorry, I move to the next question. Here's the next question for you. Ruling governments use sedition laws and other draconian measures to counter journalists. Why don't global organizations voice to link funding aid with media freedom? Would this be effective?
International organizations like IPI work with UNESCO, and as UNESCO is a UN body, they work with the governments closely. We use that connection between UNESCO and the governments, and they do the advocacy, which is not visible to most of us, but it's direct advocacy, closed door diplomacy, which is done by UNESCO. And organizations like IPI, CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, or in India, Editors Guild, we do a lot of public diplomacy and public advocacy in terms of raising the issue, talking to journalists, talking to the governments, issuing statements. So international organizations do a lot. Funding alone doesn't mean anything. We do fund programs that promote or raise the visibility of attacks on journalists or issues of press freedom. But what we need now is young journalists who will be joining the newsrooms to claim their right for press freedom, to claim their right to be safe. Unless they themselves do it, international organizations and others can't do much. It's the journalist bodies, the federations of journalists in the countries, the unions, and the media organizations themselves have to be assertive. That will help us too in being more forceful and partnering with these organizations of journalists themselves to raise their voice. We can be catalysts, but those who are affected, they have to raise their voice first.
Sorry, here's the next question. Censorship or authoritarian theory have related with freedom of press. There is a relationship between censorship and authoritarian theory?
What has emerged because of COVID-19 is that democracies and authoritarian regimes are all similar when it comes to controlling the media. They all take actions because they fear or they don't like journalists speaking truth to power. The best democracies in the world have also clamped down on journalists when they exposed corruption, when they talked about shortcomings in COVID response. So we can't say that only authoritarians do it. Even the biggest democracy in the world is doing it. And we saw previous former US president calling mass media, very reputed media, as fake news, or those promoting fake news. So democracies and authoritarians are alike when they come to stifling press freedom or attacking journalists.
Thank you, sir. We have not many questions here.
But still, due to the time constraints, I'm stopping here and move my mic to Manju ma'am.
Thank you, Ravi. I know you are having a very hectic day, and we sincerely appreciate your time and making the participants aware about the issues of global media freedom. We look forward to work with IPI in future training events. Thank you for the informative session once again.
Thank you, Manju, for inviting IPI, and I thank you on behalf of not just IPI Secretariat, but the entire network of IPI. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Sanjay Kapoor, the editor of Heart News magazine, New Delhi. Sanjay is also the first elected secretary of the prestigious Editors Guild of India. He is a foreign policy specialist focused on India and SAARC region, and also West Asia. Sanjay is credited with the exposure of India's most significant corruption scandal, the Jain Hawala scandal in 1996, when he was the bureau chief of Blitz News magazine. He later wrote a book, Bad Money, Bad Politics. Sanjay is the founder of the editor of the Heart News magazine, a political monthly. The magazine has been correct in its prediction of the parliament elections in 2004, 2009, and 2014. Heart News had accurate analysis of 2019 elections as well, moving away from daily news cycles to detailed on-ground reporting. The Editors Guild is considered the top of editors, critically looking at both the media and the state. It was founded in 1978 with two primary objectives of protecting press freedom and raising the standards of editorial leadership of newspapers and magazines. Sanjay has always voiced for free and independent media. We shall hear his insights on press freedom. Participants, you have a great opportunity to ask questions to the Secretary of the Editors Guild. Please use the link and send your questions. Nino PK shall pick the questions for the speaker. The title of this session is Brave and Bold. Just as how Sanjay has always approached journalism. His session is, Why Do They Hate Media Freedom? Welcome, Sanjay.
Thanks a lot, Manjuji, for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to listen to such illuminating discussion by my predecessors and the other panelists. I quite liked Guy Berger as well as my good friend Ravi Prasad's presentation. They paint a very scary scenario of how the journalists operate. And this wasn't like this in India before. It has become like this. So I would like to take the young listeners of the participants of this seminar into a time when it was a different age altogether. So my journey starts much earlier. Long years ago, a famous playwright and a Bollywood scriptwriter, just a minute. The scriptwriter Kamleshwar wrote a story about a journalist who smoked hard, lived frugally, and maintained irregular hours. His presence in his apartment could only be inferred from the rising smoke of his cigarette or a smell emanating from the open windows in his room. Kamleshwar was his name. He named his protagonist as Bishan Kapoor, a person he had never met. Coincidentally, Bishan Kapoor was my father, who was also a journalist. He pretty much fit this story writer's description. He was frail, smoked every kind of tobacco then, and relished asking tough questions from people in power. Not for him the quest for riches or any worldly desire to accumulate wealth. He died expectedly very young because he was also a freedom fighter and he was lived for long years underground during the freedom struggle. And he didn't leave much for the family except memories of a profession that allowed ordinary people the pride to ask tough questions from those in authority or speak fearlessly their minds. Those were the 90s, 60s, and 70s, and he was feared for his writing, but respected as people both in power and outside. Recognized the crucial role journalists played in a chaotic democracy like ours. Most of those who were in power then were either journalists or lawyers and believed that journalism made governments accountable to the people that elected them. Unlike other countries, as Manjuji also pointed out, journalism played a crucial role in India's freedom movement. Our father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi, edited Young Indian. Jawaharlal Nehru helmed National Herald, and so many others were all men of letters. If there was any other country that respected media after UK and US, it was India. I used to know so many old-time journalists. In fact, I worked with them when I was in my earlier publication, Blitz, who could just walk into Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru or his daughter Indira Gandhi's house. They were not called prostitutes or bugs or doing that or chased out as a threat to security. Those were simple days when even a slight criticism of a policy or an aspiration or an aspersion on the character of a public servant was taken very seriously. Ministers or bureaucrats resigned when such allegations were made. There are a number of scores of stories pertaining to how they used to be, above, Caesar's wife, above any kind of accusation or reproach. Even when the governments were afraid of the journalists, they did not go around making their lives miserable or getting them thrown out of their jobs. Many years later, I survived in my job with tabloid Blitz. Blitz used to be, for this generation, was a tabloid which was the largest circulated publication, which is we used to print from Bombay, and it had a very colorful editor, gentleman called Rusi Karanjia. People from the old generation would remember him. So when I broke the story in 1996, it was credited for the defeat of the Congress party. My editor, R.K. Karanjia, never asked me to resign. In fact, he celebrated my work by throwing a big party. This expose was the Jain Hawala scandal that involved a diary carrying the names of all those who were given bribes by a Delhi businessman. The diary had the names of a president, a prime minister, and scores of politicians and bureaucrats, all charged for accepting copious funds. This revelation led to the split of the Congress party and subsequently to an electoral debacle. This article was followed by a public interest litigation that caused many years of political instability, but never hurt the media or its limits. In fact, journalism felt more empowered after that. This trend continued for many years till recently. In 2003, I launched Hard News magazine. The idea was to fight the tendency for publications to opt for soft news. So if in the early 2000s, they have a publication, they only used to do what is called the pastry journalism, the stories about partying, who's rubbing shoulders with whom, and that is what we wanted to challenge. We wanted to ensure that the governments do not forget the people who were left behind in this very uneven development program, which was being initiated all around. The magazine had a very worthy partner in Le Monde Diplomatique, which is also in a certain way a left-wing publication. It had similar values and reported extensively on Maghreb and West Asia. In the last few years, though, it can be seen that governments all around the world still fear journalism, but for different reasons altogether. They don't allow them to speak to the extent of the freedom that they would want, or to write freely as much as they want. The complexity caused by technology and increased globalization has changed the way we perceive not just journalism, but also the mediums that disseminate news as well as contribute in building political narratives. In fact, the big change that has taken place in the last few years has been the zealousness displayed by governments and those in power to build narratives without really bothering too much about facts. The rise of social media, accompanied by the disdain nationalist ideologies have for history and the control exercised by elite, has allowed them to ignore facts and harp on a point of view that can be spread by WhatsApp and social media. In a certain way, it all started in 2009, 2010, during Arab Spring, which blew up a settled order in the Middle East. At that time, a view began to gain ground that new social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook could help change repressive regimes that do not allow free press. This view, peddled by some US think tanks and their State Department officials, was played out in Iran also, but with indifferent results. The truth lay elsewhere. TV and traditional media still played a big role in the ouster of Egypt's Hosni Mubarak or the president of Tunisia. These were early days, but the use of social media has been used by national ideologies since then. Traditional media has been forced to follow the social media or provide content to the vast network of WhatsApp users. Media has been plagued by issues of fake news, counterfactual, and many other issues which did not exist in our early days when we were doing journalism. In fact, we would go to a government department or whoever had news, take the facts from him and write. And they were not really challenged like they're done now. And now what has happened, you have a new breed of fact-checking websites like Alt News, like, there's another one, what is called Boom or something, which has been checking what is fake news and what is not. And that in a certain way has created a new crisis of sorts, because what has happened that because so much of content is coming into public domain, bulk of it is unmonitored. And that kind of gives a bad name to people who make a living out of journalism. Now, anyone with a smartphone can put out any content that serves the interests of the group they represent. There are no editors or anyone to check the authenticity of what goes in print. This is worrying, as it has been contributing in eroding the credibility of the media to an extent that man of the street has begun to question journalism as a profession. This serves those who resent history and how they have been portrayed by it. Many of them who have come to power now have a vested interest in ensuring that the written and spoken word of even authoritative figures remains under a cloud. Look at how many of the columns of eminent writers like Ramchand Guha or Pratap Bhanu Mehta are treated by social media. The attempt of all kinds of random people who are not even educated to the extent that they can question people like them is to run down the credibility of these gentlemen and to tell the readers that they are biased and they have to take their submission with a pinch of salt. The past version of history is being challenged in a manner that we've not seen. And even journalism that way is turning out to be a casualty. Recently, there was a lady author from a Western university who writes in the Mughal period, who was trolled heavily for, articulating points of view which were very well known. I mean, she went a bit more granular, but the fact is that she was writing about it. And even those journalists or columnists who wrote about what she was discussing were not spared. This desperation to control the narrative and headlines incessantly worries many of those who are in power, using their immense resources to win elections and earn legitimacy by managing the media. Powerful leaders work hard to ensure the curious journalists who ask questions are discouraged by the authorities to get their hands on facts. It's apparent that the governments are afraid of the truth getting out, and nothing more can be said now. Even Ravi Prasad pointed it out that during the pandemic, this was an occasion where the media was tested in a very, very big way. And in India, at least, not so much in Africa and other places that he was mentioning, we lived up to the expectation of the masses and of our own standards and reported fearlessly and fairly about return of the migrants, the grave oxygen crisis that led to so many deaths, and also undercounting of the people who have departed during the pandemic. They could perhaps do it as the government was largely absent and the death was staring at everybody. Many international media watchers have applauded Indian journalism during this crisis, and it's because of their contribution that we're coming close to the figures of the people who went away. I mean, if you look at the kind of credit many epidemiologists and others give to ordinary journalists who went to graveyards, who went to the crematoriums and other places, counted the dead literally one by one and came to a certain figure, that has been applauded everywhere, and that was really commendable. Ever since I got elected to the Editors Guild along with the other office bearers like our president, Seema Mustafa, and treasurer Anant Nath, we have struggled to build a coherent, principled, and non-partisan stand to defeat the narratives that blame media for bias and of being anti-government. We have defended all those media persons who have been prevented from doing their job or targeted for routinely being adversarial. The case in point is Siddhi Kappan, one of the journalists from Kerala who went from Delhi and traveled to Mathews, and he was intercepted, and he has been incarcerated for almost a year, maybe a month or two less. But that has been the state and been put away on anti-terror laws without really elaborating what wrong he was doing. So there have been so many who have been targeted for something or the other. In less than a year, Editors Guild had issued 31 press statements and filed 2 petitions against the use of sedition against journalists, and also deployment of a military-grade surveillance software Pegasus against the journalists. This is, unique for us. EGI doesn't have a track record of going to the court very much or filing petitions, but these are extraordinary times, and we thought that this is the moment where we should question the use of sedition against journalists. This is a law which was brought in by the Britishers way back to check freedom fighters. People like Mahatma Gandhi and many others were hauled up under this law. In fact, the Mahatma Gandhi would say, if the sedition has not been applied on them, then something is missing. But these are different times. In 2009 itself, even the Britishers decided to do away with sedition. And therefore, since 1947 to 2009, one of the reasons why this law persisted was also it's still there in some of the countries. Now, if we look around, we find that there is no use of this law, but still in India, due to some reason or the other, or raising the security scenario that that the country is under threat, this law has been allowed to persist. So Editors Guild decided to file a sedition petition against sedition, and more recently, when there was an expose that a military-grade software has been used to go after journalists. And this kind of thing is also a manifestation, as I said, which is the theme of my entire conversation, that the state is mortally afraid of the journalists. They just don't want to let them breathe easy. They want to keep track of what they're doing and what they're saying. And I'll tell you why it is happening. Why do I say they are afraid of us? Look at the number of journalists who have been targeted by the government through the use of the Pegasus. Till 2019, 40 Indian journalists have been found to have been surveilled allegedly by the authorities, as this Israeli software is only sold to governments. There is a possibility that between 2019 and now, as we speak, more journalists and more civil society activists could have been targeted. And there is no suggestion that this intrusive surveillance and hacking was ever stopped after it was acquired in 2018. So we have data only up to 2019, but subsequent to that, you had many occasions where the government could have been probing, and this is how the software had to be used. It could be doing it now. So many people who thought that they were taking a very bold stand and their name did not figure, on a lighter vein, I can say they can take heart. They may still be there. Another reason why it is so visible that the state is so afraid of independent media is the fact the government alone does not have the monopoly over all the information. New internet tools cut both ways. The Pegasus investigation not possible if A, journalists from all over the world had not come together to ferret out the truth about surveillance. B, this coalition of media and civil society organizations did not have the technological skills to find out whether a surveilled phone had been infected. Earlier, these skills were available to the government authorities only. Now, no longer. You have so much of knowledge and technology outside the government space that even the government feels threatened. Similarly, the tools of journalism have also changed. Now, journalists do not have to ask the government, journalists do not have to ask government departments and agencies whether an incident like the Chinese intrusion into our border has happened or not. Satellite images and open source intelligence allows journalists to know pretty much ahead of government of what's happening in different geographies. The face-off with China is a good example. Despite these changes and the threat that the government perceives from the media, traditional media is in a pretty miserable shape. This is the fact which was pointed out by one of our panelists also, and what needs to revive it. This is bad for freedom of expression and its independence. Media houses are cutting down on reporting and sacking journalists. The pandemic has been one of the biggest causes of this terrible state media is in. More journalists have died from coronavirus than one would have expected. Worse, they have no protection from the state or their own organization. Freelancers are in a worse shape. The only cause for some kind of solace is that Indian journalists are not alone in this, but this is an issue which applies to different societies and different democracies. Invariably, media houses that have to rely, and the reason why it is happening is that media houses are running out of money. The economies are in a bad shape. There is no real investment getting into new sectors. There are no advertising which has been coming out. There is a large dependence now on government advertising. They are the only ones who are tom-tomming that they have done a great job in fighting coronavirus, or they have done a great job in doing a few other things that do not exist on the ground. But that is the advertising most of the media organizations really want. And the attempt surely is to advance a narrative which many of the editors may not agree with, but they are bending backwards to appease the powers that be to ensure that their papers remain viable, they continue to function. And I don't fault them, because if no money comes into the publication, many of these journalists will go away. They won't get an opportunity to write or to even look after their families. And I keep telling many of my peers that people who lose their jobs, they may not find their job again, because media is going through such a major churn. Old jobs are gone away. There are multitasking which is required, multi-skilling which is required among journalists, and much of the job losses that are taking place is also those who cannot keep pace with the technology. So as was brought out by a colleague of mine, that now journalists have to do many things. I mean, they used to blog, then you need to take videos, they need to write, they need to speak, and they do podcasts, and many people who just got into journalism for the passion of writing, they would find themselves very inadequate. So whenever a crisis like this takes place, like the pandemic is taking place now, there are people who lose their jobs, and younger, fitter, and more versatile people are given preference over them. And the other reason why many people, the kind that I have referred to, old timers, is also because when they are the ones who actually oppose the ideology of the state, and the owners find a reason to weed them out because they don't want to face the heat from the government. And those editors who manage to hang in there and pursue an independent line end up facing either court cases or raids, as it happened recently at the Dainik Bhaskar group. In the last year, we in Editors Guild have issued statements largely against such misuse of state power. To tell you frankly, we have soldiered on, but find ourselves quite inadequate against those large armies of trolls and their sponsors that are adamant in controlling the narrative against the media. As India enters 75th year of independence, ideally the country should revisit the values of a secular republic and work for institutional strengthening. That also means rebuilding the media and allowing them to be a voice of the poor and the helpless. This effort is getting more difficult with each passing day. Thank you so much for giving me a time to speak on these difficult issues.
Thank you, Sanjay. Now we have a lot of questions for you. Our faculty, Ninu PK, shall moderate.
Hello, sir. I'm Neenu, and I'll be moderating the question answer session.
Thank you.
Okay. So shall we begin?
Yes.
Okay, so this first question is by Sai Harsha. And the question is, to what extent are media owned or controlled by the government? And does this influence their diversity of views?
Our media only controls what is really of concern to them. I think there are certain aspects they want to ensure when it comes to, their perception of history, or for that matter, how they want certain events to be reported. They don't actually poke their nose in everything. Like, for instance, on the issue of the Afghan crisis which is taking place, for example, I don't think media has the government has a position on that. So you will find, a range of issues, a range of reporting which will be available. But when it comes to something which is closer to them in terms of their politics or its implications on their domestic politics, they would be far more, in terms of aggressive in managing it. So whether, you talk about, as I said, the pandemic, at the time when it was happening, there weren't too much of interference because I think everybody was in hiding, and people who could really manage it were also either impacted by coronavirus or probably they got infected by coronavirus. But after they came out, emerged from that period of confinement, you can see how there is an aggression when it comes to managing the numbers of people who may have been infected by the coronavirus, how many people have been vaccinated, and everything is being challenged. If there is a report which emerges which shows that maybe only 1% of people have been vaccinated, and there would be it will be contradicted immediately by a government agency, and there would be something to show that this is fake news. Because now what has happened, that anything that is unpalatable for the government is branded as fake news, and that in a certain way lowers the credibility of whoever the writer or the publisher is, and they try to recorrect it. So that is how most of the publications are working or conduct. So when you say that the state is controlling them, the state controls headlines, they control the content of things that matter to them. Rest of the stuff they will not. Like take the Olympic success stories. So time and again there's an attempt to show that the prime minister played a very big role, and he was the one who kind of raised the morale of the people. Could be right, could be wrong, but in a certain way nearly all the publications, all the major TV outlets will say the same thing. So that is how it works.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Now we have the next question. And that question is, what is the future of independent news reporting in India in the days of snooping software and hatred against journalism?
I mean, the fate of the future of independent news reporting was always challenged in some ways by different, you can say, entities which were there. Technology provides a challenge, technology provides an answer also. So as I pointed out, even with Pegasus, very sophisticated technology is concerned, you had a international coalition actually working to expose it. This was something which has never happened before. Say for the exposure of the Panama Papers, when a lot of media organizations got together and they did something like this. But now you look at how media organizations also got together and access a technology to keep a watch on how the phones are getting infected. So I think this jostling for who goes ahead will continue, and there would be independence that the people will exercise. But I think the bigger challenge is on the viability of the news media, as rightly pointed out by Mr. Berger, that the viability of news media is more worrying. If newspapers and magazines and media outlets don't make money, that can be it'll be very difficult to have freedom. Largely, whoever funds it will end up controlling it. So there has been change in models of various publications. How do you run your affairs? Money has come in from foundations run by a clutch of businessmen in, say, Bangalore, IPSMF. A few more have also put in money. But that is not a long-term thing. People have at some stage need to pay for what they read. If they don't pay for it, they don't respect. So eventually we will have to go in that direction. And that is how the media will survive. The threat is not so much from technology as such as about the viability of these ventures.
Thank you for answering that question. This next question is, what is Editor Guild of India's stand on Pegasus issue?
Editors Guild of India came out with a statement on the Pegasus, and we were very critical of how, the phones, which is a very critical issue of a journalist, a very critical equipment for a journalist, that have been intruded. We also raised the issue of hacking, which is a criminal offense, because Pegasus is not just, what is it called, a surveillance software. Governments are known to listen to the conversation of people they are not fond of, or people they consider hostile to their interests. But hacking is a serious offense. You cannot enter a phone and access emails and send out material, take care of their what is it called, photographs. So we have taken a very strong view. In fact, what we did is also file up public interest litigation in Supreme Court. On the 16th of August, our petition is coming up for hearing. So anybody who's really interested can keep track of how the Chief Justice of India, Mr. Ramanna, countenances or takes cognizance of our petition. It had come up earlier, but the government of India, as is practice, decided that they were not ready to respond to the question, and they said they needed some more time. So the petition of ours is coming up on the 16th, and that would be an occasion to really understand what our stand is.
Thank you, sir. Okay, shall we move on to the next question?
Yep.
This is the next question. Twitter banned Congress handles yesterday. How do you see this? Does the power center fear criticism?
No, this is very unusual, actually, how Twitter has gone about succumbing to the pressure of the state. They were perceived to be independent, and they were perceived to be, an independent entity which could really look the government in the eye. In fact, this is how his profile had increased about a month and a half back, when they were taking on some of the handles of the ruling party. But now you just look at it, how they have agreed primarily to every possible dictate that may have come from the state, because there is no real evidence of why so many Congress handles. I mean, Rahul Gandhi is understandable because he, in a certain way, violated the code of ethics when it comes to, revealing the name of somebody who has been subjected to sexual assault, or somebody who's died. So there may be some logic in that, but this is a fact. This is a code which has been violated many times. But what about many others, and for how long do they want to do it? Because more than 6 or 7 days that this Twitter handle was put on hold, and ideally it should have been allowed, because there could have been a demand for apology from Twitter, and subsequently he could have been allowed to become in Rahul Gandhi. But what about thousands of Congress Twitter handles? So what we are seeing is very unusual, and what kind of intrigues me is that the Congress party is not making too much song and dance about it. In fact, they are rather reserved and circumspect about allowing it to carry on for some more time. They should have gone to the streets and made some noise about it.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. Actually, we have a lot of questions coming up, but due to the limited time, we have to reduce the question. So this is the last question in the session.
Any other questions? If you find some questions which are interesting, they can email to me, and I can answer them. That's not an issue.
Sure, sir. Thank you. Then we'll email the rest of the questions. But do you have time for one more question?
Yep.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so the last question of this question answer session is this. In India, when facts are manipulated and presented in a way which suits their agenda by reputed media houses, what action can be taken to prevent this and clear the path for truth?
The manipulation of facts is something that has been brought up time and again, and there are ways to sort this matter, or at least fight this, challenge it. There is an entity called the Press Council of India. So if anybody finds a reason, that finds an example or evidence of facts being manipulated, leading to a harassment of an individual or causing some kind of grief to an individual, these matters can be taken to the Press Council. Or if it is a defamatory content, there could be case of defamation that can be filed. In fact, this is a major challenge for many media organizations. Whenever any defamation case comes up, we are fighting against that, also criminal defamation. But the fact is that there are a number of ways those challenges could be met. And surely people who do wrong, who manipulate facts, can be put in the dock.
Okay, sir. So that's all the questions that we have in this session. And the rest of the questions will be mailed to you. So participants can type their question in the Mentimeter, and we will mail the questions to sir, and sir can answer. So thank you so much for answering all the questions and spending so much time with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes.
So thank you, sir. Now I'll hand over the session to Manju ma'am.
Thank you, Nino. Thank you, Sanjay, for your enlightening session. Media freedom is surely not at someone's mercy. It is a right of the citizens to have access to free and independent media. Democracy is in danger when media becomes mouthpieces and channels of propaganda. We appreciate your stand as an editor of Hard News with a focus on long-form journalism and as the Secretary of Editors Guild. We wish you good luck in bringing the change that you envision. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's been wonderful speaking with you and your huge constituency of people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you once again. Our next speaker is Professor Cherian George. We are extremely sorry, Professor, because of the delay, and we had some technical issues in the beginning, and we are sorry for making you waiting for your session. Our next speaker is Professor Cherian George. Professor Cherian George is a professor of media studies and associate dean, research and development, Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor George received his PhD in communication from Stanford University. He has a master's from Columbia University School of Journalism and a BA in social and political sciences from Cambridge University. He's an expert on media freedom, censorship, and hate propaganda. His books include Red Lines, Political Cartoons, and the Struggles Against Censorship, published by MIT Press in 2021. Media and Power in Southeast Asia from Cambridge University Press in 2019, and Hate Spin, the Manufacture of Religious Offense and Its Threat to Democracy, published by MIT Press in 2016. Before joining academia, he was a journalist with the Straits Times in Singapore, the country of his birth. Professor Cherian, we are delighted to have you. Participants, you can ask your questions to Professor Cherian on the Mentimeter link shared in the chat box. Tara CB shall pick the questions and ask the question answer session. The title of the session is Media and Democracy in a Populist Age. Welcome, Professor Cherian George.
Thank you very much, Manju. I would have actually happily waited longer in order to have the privilege of continuing to listen to Guy, Ravi, and Sanjay. I've learned a lot from them already. And I was actually taken by surprise that it's already my turn. So thank you. It is especially a pleasure to join you in Trivandrum, as well as those of you joining from elsewhere in India. But Trivandrum in particular, because my parents are actually buried there. They spent their entire working life in Singapore, where I was born, but always wanted to go home to Kerala, spend there. My father spent his final years in Trivandrum, passed away there, buried in the CSI church, and my mother joined him much later and buried in a family plot there. It's also a great pleasure, personally meaningful, to join you all at the cusp of your 75th year of independence. Again, not only because of the family connection, which is deep, because my parents, of course, were teenagers in the run-up to independence, and would constantly as a child, I'd hear stories about the great pride that they took in, when India finally was free of colonial rule, and they continued to be very, very, very proud of their Indian Republican heritage. All of us in Singapore as well. I mean, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Indian freedom fighters in Malaya and Singapore. Our independence struggle was relatively free, very smooth and free of bloodshed because Indian freedom fighters had done the hard work. So by the time it came to our turn in the 1950s and 60s, the process was much smoother because I guess the British were already sufficiently demoralized and had given up hope of controlling Asia anymore, thanks to the wonderful work of Indian nationalists, and we in Southeast Asia and also had benefited from it. So of course, this is at many levels, it is a very, very profound moment and a very profound anniversary. In that historical mode, I just want to reflect on some of the mega trends that the world and Asia have gone through over the last century. India, like Singapore, where I am now, although I work in Hong Kong, I'm just on vacation back home in Singapore. Part of the world's dramatic and even heroic journey away from the age of empires. And then I guess that there are two important mega trends that are encapsulated in this moment. One, of course, was decolonization, which I think was achieved fairly successfully. Although, of course, as you know, there's also this trend of what can be called neo-colonization, which we are certainly not rid of. But it is quite remarkable that we are most nations on this earth no longer need to owe allegiance to distant capitals. But the other, of course, very important trend that in a way is definitive of the 20th century is a succession of democratizing waves, right? And such that democracy, at least in spirit, if not on the ground, is taken as the norm. People take it for granted that they should be ruled with their consent, that the powerful ultimately owe their jobs to the powerless. This is also the 30th anniversary of the end of the Cold War. And since then, most of what used to be the Soviet Empire, again, has become democratic to varying degrees. In Asia, over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen South Korea, Indonesia, Taiwan turn democratic. And these are, of course, profound changes for the people in these countries. But as Manju intimated at the beginning of the session, there's also been significant backsliding. What we hoped would be an onward trend, of convergence towards liberal democracy never really transpired. Over the last 10 years or so, there has been very little advance in democracy levels around the world. There has been significant backsliding in the form of tyrants coming back into power, most recently and quite dramatically in Myanmar, for example. And again, as Manju pointed out, we are reminded that even so-called liberal democracies, are not free from authoritarian tendencies, which I guess shouldn't surprise us because liberal democracy never promised the world that they had re-engineered politicians or genetically transformed them into freedom-loving beings. No, that was never the point, right? We need democracy and checks and balances precisely because power tends to corrupt, and power will corrupt regardless of what political system we live in. That's why democracies need checks and balances, because even in democracies, leaders are prone to do nasty things if they can get away with it. So democracy, the idea behind democracy is to make sure that leaders get away with as little as possible. Because and thus protect us from the nasty things that tyrants and unchecked power can do. So this is nothing new, right? I mean, we have to think of that as the norm throughout human history. People with power have treated those without power very, very badly. Analytically, at least, it shouldn't be puzzling or surprising that the world continues to be filled with the greedy and the corrupt and individuals and groups who will cause great suffering in order to fulfill their own need for wealth and power. There is a newer trend, though, that I want to focus my remarks this evening on, which is not so much about tyrants. It's not so much about the people on top. It is what I call the dark side of people power. Until recently, when we talked about media and politics, we tended to assume that democratization meant a shift of power from rulers to the people. It was assumed that any concession that the state makes to the popular will would improve human rights. It is now clear, though, that that is a myth. That in fact, when political space opens up, it may actually be occupied by popular movements that are anti-democratic or even downright dangerous to their fellow citizens. This is extremely worrying, and I don't think we have fully grasped the importance, the significance, and the sheer danger of this trend. This, of course, wasn't supposed to be where democracy ended up. I think in the back of our mind, we always assume that there's some kind of virtuous cycle. Give people freedom, and people will not only appreciate freedom for themselves, but will also see the need to grant freedom to others in society, and will also see the need to support freer media. It has not worked out that way. Instead, what we have found over the last 20, 30 years is that in Asia, for example, as people become, as power shifts to the people, many communities prefer to keep that power for themselves, use that power against people who are not like them, against people that they have a historical grudge against, and in that process often use their newfound power against institutions of democracy, including the press. So paradoxically, even though there has been this mega trend towards greater people power, there has, as other speakers have eloquently highlighted, there hasn't been a commensurate increase in media, in the power of independent media. Far from it. Media now seem to face an additional threat, not just a threat from the familiar quarters, meaning political tyrants and big business, but a third threat in the form of what Indonesians call mobocracy, the mob, right? Popular will. And this is an Asia-wide, in fact, global threat. One important data point that Ravi already pointed out earlier, the killing of journalist Gauri Lankesh, shot dead outside a home in Bangalore. Journalists have died before and so on, but what was unusual about this? it didn't seem to be, killing ordered by tyrants, right? It was something more mysterious. Alleged killers were Hindu extremists intent on silencing a vocal opponent of the hegemony of the Brahmin caste, according to some analysts. And I think what was even more remarkable was that although this brazen assassination of a highly respected senior journalist did provoke blanket news coverage, moving eulogies, and significant outrage, that was not how everyone responded. As you will know better than I do, there were also vile comments on social media welcoming a death. And unfortunately, that kind of dynamic is not at all unusual. We find we find ordinary people, some of them, of course, may be instigated by powerful interests, celebrating harm being done to fellow citizens, including to journalists. And I think compared with the old-fashioned top-down tyranny, I think it's much harder to wrap our heads around this kind of intolerance from below, this dark side of people power, as I put it. So popular sentiment seems to be a potent but not always positive force around Asia and the world. Of course, in the good old days, in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, people power in Asia was associated with increasing freedom from tyranny. Democratic media supported and benefited from mass movements in the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and so on. But if you look at the first 2 decades of the 21st century, people power has this ambiguous quality with Janus-faced impact on media and democracy. Yes, it is, people power is still capable of having a co-starring role in emancipatory events, in freedom movements. So for example, next door in Malaysia, the Bersih movement, and pro-democracy movement helped to lay the ground for the ruling party's first defeat in almost 6 decades. Malaysians were tired of the corrupt, entrenched ruling party that they had. But unfortunately, that isn't not even typical. You often find popular movements so stealing the limelight for the wrong reasons. Asia, I think, has discovered the hard way that newly empowered people are not always keen to share their freedoms with communities they find disagreeable. So many people see no contradiction in using their free speech to silence the voices of others. They see no contradiction in using, for example, their freedom to assemble and to protest in order to drive others away. So one of the most striking and worrying examples, of course, would be what has happened in Myanmar. As soon as it turned the corner towards greater democracy, you find the majority swept by Burman Buddhist nationalism, embarking on what will probably go down as this century's first genocide. In India, people power has been expressed in Hindu majoritarianism, which has pushed the republic decisively away from its the tradition on which the republic was founded. In China, socialism with Chinese characteristics has morphed into Han Chinese nationalism at the expense of Uyghurs and other minorities, and to increasing consternation of its neighbors. In the Philippines, site of the politics that was labeled people power, in an inspiring way in 1986. That same people power now props up Rodrigo Duterte, whose methods of dealing with crime and dissent have not only been autocratic and arbitrary, but murderous and astonishingly popular. So a democracy, a system that is meant to settle differences justly and peacefully, has been used against itself. It generates mass support to legitimize demagoguery, to legitimize extrajudicial killings, lynch mobs, and even war. So this rise of intolerant populism, this dark side of people power, I think is a profoundly anti-democratic force, which I feel poses the single most complex and pressing set of ethical challenges facing the journalism profession worldwide. I think it's especially difficult for journalists to deal with it, which is why you rarely see journalists even talking about it, because journalists traditionally equate their democratic role with standing on the side of the people against powerful elites. And that's always been seen as unproblematic. What is the democratic role of journalists? We are the voice of the people, and elites are the who we serve as a watchdog against, right? But what do we do when siding with the people means siding with forces with no great commitment to human rights? What if the people have no great respect for social justice? And I think, like political parties, news media organizations have responded to this reality in a variety of ways. Some, unfortunately, I don't think the majority, some media have committed themselves to human rights norms. So they stand up for the dignity and welfare of vulnerable minorities, even if it means alienating the majority of their audience. At the other extreme are the media that actually encourage, incite, amplify populist intolerance, and thus become agents of hate. I think in between, I suspect most journalists are simply unsure, are confused. But how do we reconcile what they have learned in journalism school, that journalists serve as the voice of the people, with this new reality that the voice of the people may be hateful, anti-democratic, illiberal, murderous. And I think journalists need to develop a stronger and more refined understanding of what it means to serve democratic culture, what does it mean to be a nation-building press, and so on. And it has to start with understanding the importance of equal rights as a key pillar of peaceful and just societies. Another of the dilemmas I think that journalists face is, how do you cover newsmakers who promote intolerance? On the one side, on the one hand, the public does need to be told what such politicians and religious leaders are saying, not just to be fair to them, but also to allow others to counter their harmful ideas in open debate. But on the other hand, media coverage of intolerant leaders can give it a legitimacy and amplification that they do not deserve. In countries with multiple 24-hour news channels, there seems to be this symbiotic love-hate relationship between TV producers who are hungry for sensational content and political and religious leaders happy to oblige by giving them a constant stream of extreme and shocking speech, usually at the expense of vulnerable minorities. And I think Asia's news media landscape includes, we can't generalize, it includes media across the spectrum. There are active agents and passive enablers of intolerant populism, as well as very conscientious opponents of this trend. And I'm sure if you think about the media in your own country, you'll be able to put them in these different categories as well. Media, of course, are also victims of this populism. So autocrats who wish to silence those who want to speak truth to power have found in populism a convenient weapon to use alongside their traditional state and corporate levers. So demagogues like Rodrigo Duterte portray themselves as insurgent men of actions who will finally rescue the people from the clutches of a corrupt establishment. And they lump the so-called fake news press into the corrupt establishment that they are promising to overthrow. So that's the kind of new challenge that the media are facing now. This bigotry, of course, is extremely troubling at multiple levels, and I think one of the most shocking things to me has to do with the problem of impunity that Guy talked about earlier. So even the flavor of impunity has changed. I think it used to be that we would associate the problem of impunity with crimes done in the shadows, and then the authorities don't have the will or the resources, or because they're complicit, are unable to find out what exactly happened. There's not enough evidence of what happened, and so the perpetrators get away with it. I think what's remarkable about the kinds of attacks that we see on media as well as on ordinary citizens is that it is taking place in relatively open societies, often filmed with multiple camera phones and so on. The perpetrators actually take pride in their crimes. So what in the world is going on there? It's almost like a computer game where the perpetrators of violence seem to be chalking up, social credits based on the brazenness of their attacks on vulnerable individuals, including occasionally the media. So these are crimes that occur in plain sight, but then, so it is not the fact that it happened that is disputed, but in fact, what's denied is that there's anything actually wrong with it, because these crimes are said to are diminished or rationalized away as simply the victim getting what they deserved, right? So this again, I think we shouldn't underestimate how even the problem of impunity has changed and become far uglier in recent decades as a result of this larger trend of populism. And so while journalism faces many threats, and I think we've had unfortunately a very depressing evening. Guy started by wishing all Indians a happy birthday. This has not been a happy discussion by any means, but I think it reflects the seriousness of the challenges that media faces. And few of these challenges, I think, strike so deeply at the core of the profession than this kind of tribalism that tolerates and even celebrates the killing of not only journalists but fellow citizens for simply just being on the wrong side, according to the perpetrators. I think what's especially troubling for journalists is that we tell ourselves that what separates us from marketing and propaganda is that we are committed to the public interest. So what do we do when it turns out that large sections of that very public are not merely indifferent, but actually antagonistic towards the work that we do and our values? This, I think, is the #1 challenge facing any journalist in the coming decades. And of course, you've got to start with, how did it come to this? How did it come to a situation where large numbers of people in many countries consider the press the enemy, when the press lives by an ethos of working for the people? And of course, some of this animosity is instigated in a very cynical way by political leaders like Duterte and others. But I think it would be we would be in denial if we said that it is all the politicians' fault. And surely we must accept, as journalists, we must accept some of the responsibility. I think, and Sanjay, I think, alluded to this earlier in his remarks when he talked about the problems of soft news and so on. And in fact, critical scholarship of media has long understood that if you put aside the self-conception of what journalists do, the reality on the ground is quite different. Media's reliance on advertising revenue, for example, makes them less attuned to the needs of citizens, especially citizens who don't have consumer power, right? We have a commercial media system across the world that has chronic allocative distortions. So lifestyles of the rich and famous are analyzed more thoughtfully and more thoroughly than the life chances of the poor. Most publishers are content with newsrooms whose class profiles are wildly unrepresentative of the general population. And it's been like this for decades. And perhaps this mismatch, the fact that in reality, most journalism does not do what journalists promise, which is to reflect the actual aspirations and needs of ordinary citizens. Perhaps this kind of imbalance was tolerable in past decades, when throughout the world, people believed that if we just went along with this system, we went to university, for example, we strive for a higher education, we would enjoy upward social mobility. More and more around the world, this has been exposed as a myth, right? There's the global stagnation. It turns out that there is no such easy formula for either individual or societal progress. And I think this has to be part of the reason why across the world you find anti-establishment protests, including attacks on mainstream media. There's this deep frustration with that the system simply does not work for people. And so what we have ended up with is a kind of, yes, we are still democracies at some level, but it's a very these are Frankenstein democracies with grossly skewed democratic norms. We believe in the principle of popular will, but this is marshaled to justify intolerant populism. We believe in majority rule, but this has become majoritarianism at the expense of human rights. We believe in people power, but often this becomes might is right, law of the jungle kind of democracy. Unfortunately, I think journalism has contributed to this imbalance. I think journalism has more easily adopted the mission of promoting freedom and much less willing and able to promote equality. And of course, you need both. And democracy is built on the twin pillars of freedom and democracy. The freedom message comes more easily to journalists because, of course, media as an institution benefit from freedom. The relationship between media, especially commercial media, and equality is much more tenuous. And I think we've been neglecting that for decades, perhaps even centuries. Because what it boils down to is a very difficult but necessary commitment, I think, on the part of media to champion the weak in society, even the weak who are not actually your customers or your clients, and even if the advertisers are not interested in them. That's a difficult call. It is difficult for I think editors and publishers based on pure human rights principles, to tell themselves and their staff that yes, we are going to defend disadvantaged minorities, even if it means offending our customers, our intolerant customers who prefer the status quo. That's a difficult call for journalists. There are very few media that actually are willing to take such a moral stand. But I would argue that if we are going to fulfill the promise of sovereign nations that are not just independent from empires, but also willing to share the fruits of that freedom with every citizen, that's the kind of moral stand that media have to make. Let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cherian. Our faculty, Tara Sibi, shall moderate the question and answer session.
Good evening, sir.
This is Tara Ravishankar, and I'll be moderating this session. And that was a very thought-provoking session. And you have discussed about populism and media. Now I move to my first question. Here is a question. Even after living in a democratic country like India, journalists are exploited and treated like puppets by higher and powerful authorities. How can our journalists be brave and fight against this?
How can journalists fight against? Fight against what exactly? Sorry, could you repeat that?
Fight against this particular status of journalism. That means they are treated like puppets, and is that mentioned in the question?
Okay, I'm reading the question now.
Should I repeat it?
No, I can see it on the screen. How can journalists be brave? Well, I'm sure that I don't think India has a shortage of brave and able journalists, but as some of the speakers have pointed out earlier, in order for democracies to get the media that they deserve, it's not just about individual commitment or passion or values. Big countries need well-organized institutional media with large newsrooms that can do the job of covering complex events and so on, right? And that requires resources. And I think around the world, the missing link, as it were, is not really a shortage of individuals with personal commitment or the right values. We're really searching for business models that can actually sustain financially, news organizations that are able to turn that commitment into a living that can actually allow you to feed your families. It boils down to that. We can't just public interest journalism. Let me put it this way: public interest journalism for any country is something too important to simply leave up to the goodwill of individual citizens who feel this calling to sacrifice, on behalf of journalism. No, we wouldn't. That's not how we run anything else in society. You know, we don't say that, okay, how do we make sure that we have enough good healthcare? Okay, let's just depend on the charity of doctors. Let's hope that there are enough good nurses who will volunteer as and serve us as good nurses. No, we make sure that doctors and nurses receive the, are able to make a living in what they do, and they are adequately, provided for in institutions called hospitals and clinics that can serve the healthcare needs of the complex healthcare needs of a society. It shouldn't be any different for when we're talking about media, right? It's not about the counting on individual qualities. It's making sure that at an institutional level, we are able to organize journalism in a way that is financially sustainable. And this is a challenge for countries around the world. It's also partly a regulatory challenge. And I think this goes back to some of the comments that were brought up earlier. There is a role for regulation, even in protecting a free press. So I think in my classes in Hong Kong and Singapore, I point out, well, yes, of course, that India, compared with many countries, has or had a freer press. But one of the shocking, black spots on Indian journalism is, of course, paid news, right? Which I understand the Press Council of India tried to investigate, and the report was buried and so on. There are countries that regulate against that. It should not be permissible to mislead your readers that what appears on page 1 of a newspaper that readers think is there based on the editorial judgment of editors has actually been paid for by a party or business, right? It is simply it is dishonest, and it is the role of at least strong self-regulation, independent self-regulation, to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen, right? So I do think that the answers to your question is more institutional, regulatory, organizational, rather than how do we inject more bravery into the individual journalist.
Okay.
But thanks for the question.
Shall we move to the next question? Here's the next question. We are survival in educational basis. In a journalist or media background, how do you encourage and improve the system going on in this pandemic, maybe the pandemic situation, and they are inviting your opinion on that? That means the survival of journalist or media in this particular background.
Yeah, this is a question that you're asking the wrong person, because I think the kind of challenges we are facing in Hong Kong with regards to dealing with the pandemic, they're really nothing compared with what many parts of India are facing. So, this is the kind of thing that we need to learn from you, right? So I think hopefully when there is enough time for academics and journalists in India will tell us around the world, how you did it, how did you sustain yourself, both not just materially, but even psychologically, right? How do you perform this important, indispensable job in almost, impossibly trying times. But those of us outside, in much more fortunate situations can only look in and just be mystified at how journalists and of course all other citizens are able to continue in these times. And I hope there will be well, not just, I guess, survival tips, but also, great stories of resilience that the world can learn from in due time.
So here's your last question. I think there are so many questions coming up, but we can pick up all these questions from them. And the last question is, I think you have already discussed on mobocracy, and our students or our viewers are interested to know more on that. Mobocracy, do they have any connection with freedom of press?
Yeah, I mean, when the I've only heard this term being used in Indonesia, and what they refer to when they talk about mobocracy is the fact that I mean, Indonesian journalists have gone through a lot in the last 40, 50 years. They were for 30 years they were essentially under something resembling a dictatorship, right? No press freedom. Some of the best news organizations were banned, closed down, and so on, right? And then suddenly in, I want to say 1998, yes, 1998, the President Suharto falls, within a year, a very, very impressive press law defending press freedom and so on is brought in. Since then, Indonesia has been one of the countries in Asia where journalists actually have very little to fear from government itself, right? So there's very little hesitation among Indonesian journalists to criticize the president or and most people in power. So if you ask Indonesian journalists, what is it that makes them hesitate? What is it that makes them self-censor? Many of them will say it's the mob, right? Indonesian democracy, in their eyes, has become a mobocracy, which gets at precisely the problem that I was trying to highlight. There you have people who are sort of newly freed, and although we would like to think that people will use freedom in a reciprocal way, in other words, now that I am free, I'm going to make sure that you are free too. It often does not work out that way. And Indonesian journalists use the term mobocracy to refer to this situation where newly freed Indonesian people act like a mob. So in the Indonesian case, it has often a religious dimension. So Indonesia, as you know, is the world's largest Muslim majority country, and the Sunni majority discriminates against Shia Muslims, the Ahmadiyya, Christians, and so on, right? And uses people power in this very mob-like way. And of course, as you know from your own Indian experience, this is not at all a problem unique to Indonesia. Around the world, you have communities who happen to be in the majority, choosing to see only one side of the democracy equation. Yeah? Democracy, as I tried to highlight, has two important pillars. One, of course, is consent of the people, and the only way to find out what the people want is, of course, through one man, one vote, one person, one vote elections, and the majority, therefore, rules in that sense. But that's only one side of the equation. We still need, if that is all there is to it, you are going to end up with majoritarianism or mobocracy, which would be extremely ugly for the so-called losers, those who end up who are in minority communities, if the majority decides that they don't like the minority. So the other side of the equation has to be an absolutely inviolable commitment to individual human rights. It does not matter if you're only 1% of the population. As a human being, you have certain rights, including the right to live free from fear, the right to not be discriminated against in terms of where you live, the right to express yourself, and so on. Yeah. And unfortunately, and if there's one takeaway, I just want to suggest that you think about as India approaches the 75th birthday, it is precisely that, that yes, in Asia, we have rid ourselves of colonial rule. Yes, most of Asia now has one person, one vote. We have that side of the equation pretty sewn up, but we are doing badly on the other side of the equation. In too many countries, including Asia, citizens with the vote seem to think that they owe nothing to minorities whom they outnumber. That has to change if we want a country that we can celebrate as something worth being proud of. Because if it is only majority rule, if it is only a game of numbers where I get my way because there are more of me and you do not get your way because there are fewer of you, then that is not democracy. That is actually the law of the jungle, and there's nothing much to celebrate there because no matter whether it's the world's largest semi-democracy or a small democracy like Singapore, if that's the basis of your nation building or our nation building, there's really not much to celebrate because there isn't much that separates us then from the jungle. Thank you.
That was a very interesting talk, and your talk was really giving insights to our current journalistic scenario. Thank you, sir, once again. And now the session will move to Manju ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Tara. We sincerely thank Professor Cherian George for staying so late and presenting this great session. And your research on press freedom, hate campaigns, and censorship is greatly appreciated. Research work in these areas is crucial for understanding the scale of impact on the society. We wish you good wishes for your research and look forward to having you for advanced sessions in press freedom and censorship. Thank you once again. I request Ram Gopal Harikrishnan, our student coordinator, to extend the word of thanks.
Esteemed guests, teachers, and students, a very, very good evening to all of you. My name is Ram Gopal. I'm a student from S2 BJMC of Christnagar, Maranallur. And today I'm talking to you on behalf of the entire media department to express our heartfelt gratitude for such a fantastic session we had today. First of all, I'd like to thank God Almighty for immensely blessing us, because sure, we had a bit of hiccups here and there with technology, but at the end of the day, we had a fantastic session. So, I'm sure God had a lot to do with that. So I immensely thank God. Next, I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Jolly Jacob, and then our manager, Reverend Father, Dr. Tito, and our head of the department, Manju Rose Mathews, and every single person who has actually who had taken part in this and helped this session in being a grand success. And we all know that the freedom of press is extremely important for a smooth functioning of the democracy. And from today's webinar, we could clearly understand it even more. And, we can understand how important journalists are to the society. We had our esteemed speakers such as Mr. Berger, who talked about how historically the historical developments of press freedom, and he ended his session with the fantastic the three requirements that the journalists look for in these days, like viability, transparency, and capacity. And then we had the next speaker who talked about was Mr. Ravi Prasad, who talked about the International Press Institute. He talked about the different programs and the kinds of threats that journalists face these days. And next we had Sanjay Kapoor, who talked about how journalists are troubled in the present days, especially due to the rise of social media. Everyone can post any content these days. And, and how news organizations are cutting down on journalists and employees, mainly due to COVID. They can't afford them. And, we had our last speaker, Mr. Cherian George, who mainly talked about the dark side of people power, where, people use their power against other people who are in accordance with their perspectives, and about how journalists need to understand what it is to serve a democratic culture. And if we had to just like Mr. Cherian George had said, this wasn't a very positive filled discussion. We're talking about real life, where what the threats people face. But the fact is, we are living in that world. We are living in a world where these kind of things are happening. And I'm sure there are many passionate journalists among the people who are watching this right now. And we never know, maybe them on hearing this these problems, we never know that the next journalist who could come up with a big solution for these problems might be among us. So, for them, I'm pretty sure this has hugely impacted them. And, lastly, I cannot conclude my vote of thanks without definitely complimenting the participants, because, wow, just look at the questions we got. So such fantastic questions and from such different perspectives. I mean, you guys were the ones who actually made this webinar and you added to the success of it. So, a huge thanks to the participants. Again, big thanks to the speakers and big thanks to all the coordinators of this session. And thank you so much. That's all from my side. Back to the host.
Thank you, Ram Gopal. So we are concluding the international webinar on freedom of the press. Democratic countries must work to build a media environment that prioritizes free, independent, and accurate journalism to thrive. Governments need to ensure access to quality information for all strata of the population. News outlets' dependence on advertisement revenue from government and corporations need to be minimized with newer business models of subscription. Growing number of population are willing to pay for valuable and accurate news. Journalist entrepreneurs have started to experiment new models of business which focus on unbiased and quality news content. Success of such models is essential to assure a large media ecosystem rooted in free and independent journalism. Media educators need to emphasize the importance of free press in democracy. Researchers in media should study and document the issues in media freedom and explore solutions. The civil society must ensure more dialogue to promote freedom of the press and also media literacy. Judiciary and legal systems need to work as support system for promoting free speech and freedom of the press. Citizens must make policymakers accountable if their efforts are for curtailing the freedom of the press. Let us work together to make India figure among the top ranking nations in the Press Freedom Index. We are now at rank 142. We have a long way to go. Our collective resolve will surely make it happen. Participants, please find the feedback link in the chat box. Certificates of participation will be sent to all who submit the feedback form. We have a special song sung by Philip Jayakumar, who was inspired by our topic and presented this for a special occasion of 75 years of India's independence. Good night all, signing off. Team Christnagar College, Maranellu, Trivandrum.
We got freedom, gotta keep our heads held high. We got freedom, gotta keep our heads held high. When the tricolor flies above horizon, gotta keep our head held high. We got freedom. This is my home. This is the land that I was born. This is my home. This is the land that I was born. The land of the great man, the land of the brave heart, the land of the patriots, the land of the legends, the land of the mountains, the land of the rivers, the land of the strong, and the land of the meek. This is my home. This is the land that I was born. This is my home. This is the land that I was born. So we lift up our hearts and pray. God bless India. God bless India. God bless India, our homeland. God bless India. God bless India. God bless India, our homeland.
Thank you all. Good night.